Good morning, everyone. This is Joel Wood, Senior Vice President, Government Affairs at the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. Welcome on Christmas Eve. This is a recorded event, and so surely some of the things that we say may not hold up even hours from now, but hopefully they'll be good in the long run. We expected this would be a quiet week. It is anything but quiet. And 5,593 pages of a year-end funding legislation and stimulus bill. A lot to unpack in that. This webinar is going to primarily feature our legal team, our Chief Legal Officer, Scott Sender of Steptoe and Johnson, and his colleague, Kate Jensen, who is Washington's foremost expert on the Paycheck Protection Program. And we're going to try, they've had the joy during this holiday season of combing through those 5,593 pages. And there are indeed things that specifically impact the commercial insurance brokerage sector. As we predicted, as soon as it became clear weeks ago that they were going to pursue a year-end funding plan, and that's what happens on Zoom calls. As soon as that became clear, we did anticipate that the last stand on surprise medical billing was going to be made by retiring Senator Lamar Alexander. He was successful in getting provisions. Very much of a mixed bag. I'm sure you probably have seen the quotes from employer groups who have decried the accommodation that was made to arbitration and independent dispute resolution alternatives that they believe favors the hedge funds, the specialty providers, and the hospitals at the expense of employers. We're going to watch this closely. There are going to be a lot of regulations we're going to have to engage in. But I think our view of this is it's more of a mixed bag, and the word that Councilor Sender uses is stickiness to the benchmark standards that hopefully will make this on balance a good provision. Additionally, not unexpectedly, the transparency provision throughout the healthcare ecosystem, including some new broker transparency regs that will go into effect on 2022, were included in the legislation. And so Scott will talk about those. And again, PPP provisions that not only impact those who took out forgivable loans in 2020, but a second round, and Kate is going to give us a firmer description of that. We're going to send out a link to this webinar after the fact, as well as two excellent summary memoranda from Scott and Kate. And so Blair and the rest of us will be monitoring. I believe you do have a Q&A bar for any questions that pop up. We're going to try to hold this to an hour, and if we can't get to all the questions during the hour, we'll try to respond to you separately. As well, there's a chat function. Please only hit chat if you've got any technical issues. So with that, and I also, obviously, the president has said he's going to, that he may veto this. An hour ago at this moment, Speaker Pelosi sent out a dear colleague saying that she's going to call for unanimous consent to take the president up on the offer of $2,000. That is not going to get unanimous consent. And then it's a question of whether or not the president is going to veto it, and will it then be overturned. I would also note that the president last night issued a lot of pardons, including pardons for 3 corrupt former members of Congress. And my colleague, Blair Bartlett, used to work for one of those. And I'd just invite you at this moment, Blair, during the Christmas season, to give us any commentary on that particular commutation pardon. Thank you very much. As we were recording this, I think that was a well-advised word to us. And also joining us, of course, my Democratic partner, Joel Copperwood, and so we'll all attempt to engage on this. But this is the Scott and Kate show. Councilor Sender, take it away. And Blair, I think you might want to make some opening comments, and whenever you want to share the screen on our few number of slides, you can just let her know. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Blair, it's fine to go ahead and put that up. The only thing, I'm going to note a couple of things at the beginning. First, The rumor of the moment is that if the president vetoes the bill, he may choose to do so by pocket veto, which means he would just hold it. So we may not see any relief on this by year end if he does that. I think that one way or the other, by the end of January, the surprise billing provisions that we're going to go through, the PPP changes, they will be law. It's unclear how it's going to have to happen between now and then to get there, but I don't think it's going to be stale information by any means. So why don't we kind of turn now to, it's called the No Surprises Act, and let's go to the next slide. Look, as you know, and as we point out in our overview memo, the big issue for the last 2 years on surprise billing hasn't been should something be done. It's how are you going to calculate the payment that's made between plan and provider in a surprise billing in an out-of-network situation. And at some level, they kind of split the baby on this. There is an arbitration resolution process, but before then, and I'm going to go through this more in detail, the payors, are to calculate median contracted rates by geographic region for each item and service that they cover. And that's the starting point in any discussion. Why don't we step through, and it's the starting point for the dispute resolution as well for the arbitrator who resolves the payment dispute. So I think it is a little bit of a middle ground, although I'm very sympathetic to the concerns of the payors that this is going to result in a lot of costly arbitration. So let's kind of step through the details. So they're really addressing 3 scenarios: emergency services in type an emergency room type environment, as we normally think about it; non-emergency services that are performed by out-of-network providers at in-network facilities; and air ambulance services. The bill is extremely long because it basically does each one of these things 3 times. ERISA, Public Health Service Act, and Internal Revenue Code, although substantively they're all the same. The ambulance service provisions also closely track, with a couple of exceptions that I'll point out as we go. So first of all, for non-emergency services, this balance billing legislation will not apply if you get consent from the patient or the plan enrollee prior to providing the services, that they're going to receive them from an out-of-network provider. It's very prescribed. The exception does not apply to something called ancillary services, which are services in the hospital that are difficult to untie: anesthesiology, pathology, radiology, diagnostics, some hospital aid type charges. You will not be able to charge those on an out-of-network basis, even with consent. But for any other types of services that are offered in that hospital, as long as you give the notice, you tell them they have the right to get these same services on an in-network basis. You tell them what the cost is that they can expect to pay on the out-of-network basis, and you give a list of other providers in the hospital who can provide the same items or services who are in-network. If the patient signs that, then you can still bill them on an out-of-network basis for a balance billing type of arrangement. One thing I will note is that if you have no in-network services for that item or service in your hospital facility, the exception does not apply. So there's got to be an in-network alternative for the exception to apply. States are largely going to be responsible for enforcing the provisions against the hospitals and other facilities. Any state that chooses not to do so, then the Department of Health and Human Services would step in. They also may impose additional out-of-network provider obligations and penalties. There are 3 different approaches to how to resolve the then payment that would be owed by the payor, health plan or health insurance company, to the provider of the service: emergency services, non-emergency services performed by out-of-network providers, or air ambulance services. The first one is if the state has its own resolution mechanism under its state law that applies. So many of the states, their laws do not exempt self-insured plans. We've argued in the past that self-insured plans did not have to follow those laws because the states could not compel self-insured plan compliance. But now they have specific authority under federal law. So in a state like New York, I haven't gone back and looked at the details of their legislation, but if it purports to apply, then it would apply. The second exception is similar to the first. It's kind of a more specific piece. If the state is a participant in the all claims databases, all payer claims databases, then whatever mechanism they're using under that approach is what would apply here. Only 2 states to date, to my knowledge, are participants in that, Vermont and Maryland. But there's money in the bill to encourage other states to sign on, and clearly one of the objectives of the drafters is to expand the utilization of these databases and the alternative mechanisms that they provide for payment for services. But if you're in a state where neither of those two things are true, then the legislation sets out a process for resolving how much the payor will be required to pay to the provider. It starts by the provider sending a bill or an invoice to the payor. The payor then has 30 days to pay the bill, provide an alternative payment, which would be the median contracted price for that item or service that it pays to in-network providers in the same geographic region, or to dispute the bill. It can do any of the three. Once that it does that, then there is a 30-day negotiation process where the parties can try to resolve the payment requirement by agreement. If that fails, Blair, can we switch to the next slide, please? Then you go through the IDR process. So this is a great schematic, actually, that Ashley put together that sort of shows the process. So like I noted, it starts with the payment or the denial of the payment. Then you have the negotiation process. Then you can initiate the independent dispute resolution process. You have a 4-day window when the 30-day negotiation period ends to initiate the IDR process. I guess if you don't, then that median contracted amount would be the payment provided by the payor to the hospital or other facility. The parties then have a window to select a certified IDR entity. One of the many rulemakings that the Department of HHS is going to go through is to create rules around who qualifies as an IDR entity and how they're certified. If the parties fail to agree on which entity will resolve the dispute, then there'll be a mechanism for HHS to designate an IDR entity for that dispute. The parties then have 10 days from the date on which the IDR entity is selected to submit their payment offers and whatever supporting materials that they would like to include with those offers. It will include the payor's median contracted rate for the items or services, which the arbitrator must consider in the course of rendering his or her decision on what the payment will be, and any other information if it's submitted. This would include providers' level of training, their market share in the geographic region, the complexity of the item or service provided, and interestingly to me, whether there were demonstrations of good faith efforts to reach in-network agreements prior to the arising of this dispute. There are some changes here from earlier drafts. Earlier drafts only required the arbitrator to consider the median contracted rate, and then it was up to the arbitrator what other information he or she would like to see submitted to consider. So now they're compelling the consideration. But it explicitly bars the IDR entity from considering the provider's usual and customary charges, the amount public payors pay, or the amount that they invoiced. So none of those are relevant to the decision. This is baseball-style arbitration. So the arbitrator will have to pick one offer or the other and cannot split the baby, one or the other. There is no appeal of that decision, so it would be final. Can we go to the next slide, please? The loser of the arbitration pays the fees of the IDR entity. What am I missing? There'll also be a fee that HHS charges to all participants in the IDR process I think it'll be on an annual basis to cover the HHS fees in administering the program. So it's pretty robust. There'll be lots of rules. The rule that I'm watching the most and that I think we will want to participate in the most is it allows the batching of similar items or services for resolution through the process between the same provider and payor. for us, I think we would like to see self-insured plans that participate in the same preferred provider network, that have the same charging algorithms or fee agreements with those providers, be allowed to batch their claims together in one process. They do, when they talk about geographic markets, they do allow self-insured plans to band together as one market as opposed to doing it by individual plan. The language is not quite as loose with respect to the batching, but I think that this is going to be an important point for the payers to rally around. And so we're going to really focus, I think, on that in trying to get that allowed for the batching, which could make some cost difference. In addition, the bill requires a long laundry list of different transparency requirements. So they'll going forward, by the way, I should have noted this at the outset, everything that we're talking about with respect to healthcare takes effect on January 1st, 2022. The broker provisions theoretically take place a year from the enactment date. So it could be a little before, or if the president follows through on and stretches a little bit after January 1st, but it's going to be around January 1st, 2022.
Hey, Scott, if I could interrupt before we move on to the broker transparency issues. Scott House asked, does the medium network pricing all but eliminate the hospital's reliance on bill charges being relevant?
So the bill charges are irrelevant. They cannot be considered by the arbitrator. That doesn't mean that that the providers won't rally around those in those negotiations with the payors, but for the dispute resolution, the arbitrator is not allowed to consider bill charges.
And Chris Rylands, our friend from Hub, also asked, don't the results of the arbitrations have to be published? If so, is the thinking that eventually the arbitrations will settle around particular amounts that will become the de facto out-of-network reimbursement rate?
Yeah, there is a quarterly publication requirement that the department will enact with a lot of different details. I think that another area on which we will focus in the rulemaking is to try to make those disclosures as robust as possible. So you could come up with like a common law of what those arbitration amounts are rallying around.
And
Yes.
final thing, Janet, yes, we will be circulating the slides and this presentation and additional memoranda on this after the call. So back to you. Sorry to interrupt, Scott.
No, please interrupt at will. Before we do broker transparency, which I think Kate and I will share, that there's a long list of Surprise Billing Act related or No Surprises Act disclosures as well. So there'll have to be balanced billing disclosures on insurance identification cards and on websites. There's going to have to be a more robust explanation of benefits, which would include the balanced billing piece. Payors are going to have to provide price comparison guidance for in-network options that would be available to plan enrollees both by phone and on their websites. You're going to have to maintain a provider directory that must be kept up to date. You can impose obligations on the providers to inform you of any updates, but this will be a verification process. If you list a provider on the provider directory that is no longer a member of your in-network network, then the enrollee will not be liable for out-of-network charges for visits to that provider. There'll be disclosures of federal and applicable state prohibitions on balanced billing that are going to be required in a number of different places. And there'll be annual reporting to federal agencies about average premiums, the cost of the services that have been provided, and a few other items that will be detailed later. So that's kind of the nub of it in terms of the No Surprises Act. Joel, were there any other questions on that before we kind of move on to the transparency?
No.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and flip the slide, Blair. So the thing I want to emphasize the most about these transparency requirements, because it made my heart stop for a moment when I first read them, these really apply to all service providers to employer plans, all of them. That would include, we believe, third-party administrators, pharmaceutical benefit managers, wellness service consultants, anyone who is providing the services. They also include the brokers, obviously, and any compensation you're receiving from those other service providers that are related to the plans would be swept in to your disclosure obligations. So there are a few big differences from the current 5,500 reporting obligations. First of all, there is no floor for employer size that these would attach. These would apply to all plan brokerage services, whereas the 5,500 requirements only apply to plans with 100 or more participants. These are also disclosures that must be made in advance, whereas the 5,500 form is at the end of the year. And they seem to be a little bit more robust. I'm not an expert on those 5,500 forms, but they're making more of an effort here to sweep in all of the indirect compensation that you may receive from other plan providers. And I think that the rules are going to be very tight on this. And again, another area where we're going to want to be very engaged to be sure that from a practical perspective, this is something that we can comply with in an easy fashion. There'll be some flexibility regarding how compensation is disclosed, so you'll be able to use formulas, and when you have an override type situation, you'll be able to explain how it is you're paid as opposed to the exact amount you might be paid. And we'll be looking to, we'll vet this through pretty heavily with CB and with our legal counsel's working group to be sure that we're really focused on just the pragmatic aspects of delivering these disclosures from our perspective, and then making sure that we're not excluding other plan service providers to the extent that we can kind of keep them into the same regime. Kate, I said we were going to share this, and then I think I kind of did most of it. Is there anything that I missed?
Yeah, no, I think this is, you covered it, Scott, but I will say, I think one big success that we saw in this piece based on feedback we heard from council members before and what we already communicated to the Senate Help Committee when they were considering this language, is this flexibility in how you report your compensation. So the statute does provide a lot of leeway. So it can be, you know, a dollar amount, a percentage, a formula, an estimate with an explanation of sort of the assumptions you're going to be using to calculate your expected compensation, because that was something we heard loud and clear from you all, that different arrangements can get very complicated very quick in terms of how you actually calculate those compensation amounts.
Joel, do we have any questions on the broker consultant compensation transparency?
None that I've seen. First, getting back to the surprise billing, our friend Mr. Garbina asked, does this prevent the use of a Medicare reimbursement level 4 out of network?
I suppose if you have a reference-based pricing plan, and those are, you know, using Medicare-derived rates, that they would become the basis for your median contracted rates. But otherwise, yes, there's no relevance of any Medicare pricing here. In fact, Mr. Brady, the ranking member on Ways and Means, makes a big deal about how there's no benchmarking for pricing here in the bill, including for Medicare.
And Casey asked, concerned about the median contract rates, bringing those in place, 131.19, indexed by normal CPIU. Does this mean that median contracted rates won't be actual figures at that point of service, but will be a likely index figure based on outdated 2019 pricing? Any ideas on that? I don't.
So there's going to be rules around this. There are some details in the legislation, and honestly, I did not focus on that piece in terms of how retrospective it is. But for every piece of this, there's going to be rules, including rules on the initial pricing that they'll use in 2022 and beyond. That's going to be an audited process. And so HHS will audit a payor's median contracted rate calculations, both on sort of a just sampling basis, random sampling basis, as well as in response to complaints, which most likely would come from providers.
And a bunch of other, let's do some real quick ones. First of all, it'd be good to just do 30 seconds of elaboration on sort of where this all came from, when this popped up in the Health Committee a couple of years ago, and what the CB stance was toward it with respect to transparency that we support across the board, but this being broker specific. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, we had probably one of our robust board type discussions ever on this particular topic. And we had those discussions both at the CB board and then later at the full board of the council. And I think basically the upshot of it was we're big supporters of transparency on cost side, on the PBM piece. And we already are subject to some degree of transparency. So it's not like what we're getting paid is a secret. And so the thought was that it was important that we be supporting of this, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander kind of thing. And so that's where we came out. The line that we drew that was, I think, is held, although we need to study it more closely, is there was some concern that this would lapse beyond the group health benefits and include voluntary benefits beyond group health plans. And they're very different because they're really purchased directly by the individual plan participants as opposed to through the plans. And I think we prevailed on that. This is limited to the group health side. And so, you know, again, we'll have to be vigilant in the rules, but I think that was another line we were able to help keep respect.
And our CB advisory chairman, Carrie Finnegan of Mercer, at that time, asked what input might we have on the final wording of the regs. We provided input to the health bill, and it seems like the current description considers that input, but there could be twists in the road. I would also note that this was initiated back during the George W. Bush administration and proposed regs that came out of the Labor Department. And David also asked the question, what agency is responsible for issuing the proposed and final regs?
So the Department of Labor will be responsible for the compensation disclosure piece because it's for ERISA plans. There's an individual market disclosure piece as well that tracks this, and that will be done by HHS, and they will likely do these together. Joel and I already spoke yesterday talking about how the first half of 21 is going to be very busy because we will need to engage in the rulemakings on both the No Surprises Act and on this compensation piece to be sure that, you know, at least our voices are heard to try to get this to be as close to optimal as we can collectively make it.
And consistent with that, these are exactly the kind of things that are going to have to be addressed during the rulemaking process. As Ernest asked, does the broker bear responsibilities for a subcontractor's failure to comply?
What's that?
I don't think that's specified in the legislation, but I think that the obligation is going to fall with the entity that contracts with the plan. So if that's the broker and you're utilizing subcontractors that you're sort of separately contracting with, then I think the broker's on the hook probably.
And would general agent services apply to the compensation disclosures?
I'm not sure I know what that is. I mean, this is health plan specific. So anything that you're doing that's related to the plan will be covered.
And Craig asked, does the flexibility on disclosure of compensation allow you to disclose how your compensation X% of premium is earned only as opposed to the expected amount?
So it's framed, the statute is framed in terms of expected compensation, in terms of what you need to disclose. You also are going to have to disclose the services that you're providing to earn that compensation. But the formula is allowed. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but what they're getting at is your forward-looking compensation that you expect to receive under the terms of the contract, but you're going to have some leeway in how you describe that in your disclosure.
Sorry, I was muted. I believe that's all the questions that I see on compensation. unless you want to clarify anything else. I know there were other issues in there, like on FSAs that maybe we can get to, like on the antitrust provisions for health plans, but perhaps now would be a good segue into the PPP.
That makes sense. So Blair, why don't you flip it, and Kate, you take it from here.
So I guess I'll start by saying anyone who was hoping that the PPP program was going to get easier and less complicated would be sorely disappointed. It is wading through these new program amendments. It's confusing. It's unclear to me how the lenders are going to respond, because with this second round of loans, you've kind of added a layer of complexity for them. The SBA has 10 days under the legislation to draft emergency regulations, so no notice and comment, to implement all of the reforms to the original PPP program, and also to implement the new second draw program. That seems to me like a pretty tall order. Still getting regulations from them on the original program 10 months after it started. We're still getting them. So, you know, to be determined how quickly SBA is going to be able to roll out new rules and applications and so on and so forth. We expect that for most of you, your primary area of interest here is probably on the forgiveness piece of the original PPP loan. So many of you and many of your clients have already taken out loans under the original program. And there are a couple of really helpful things in here, we think. So first, they did go ahead and reverse the IRS guidance. So these forgiven business expenses will be deductible from your gross income under federal law, which is great. That's good news. A lot of business groups were lobbying hard for that change. And then, and I should preface all of this with saying, as I go through some of these amendments, if you have a PPP loan now and you do not yet have forgiveness for that loan, you get to take advantage of all of these reforms. So they all look backward to March 27th when the CARES Act was enacted. So in the second category on the slide here, they expanded forgivable expenses to include these new categories of expenses, which we think will be helpful for a lot of businesses. So this is your business software, this is your supplier costs, and anything that you have done in terms of readying your business or responding to federal or state and local orders related to COVID-19 safety. And that includes providing your employees with PPE, you know, erecting barriers in your space, maybe doing a drive-through window, things like this, expanding, you know, outdoor space, these types of things. So that we think will probably be helpful for a lot of folks. Now, bear in mind that they did not do anything to change the 60% on payroll cost requirement. So that is still there. So to the extent you can't hit the 60% on payroll costs, you're still allowed to spend your money on all these things. And then of course, anything that's not forgiven is going to carry forward as that loan at the 1% interest rate. The other thing that they did that I think is going to be really helpful for folks is that they've given you a lot more flexibility to decide what your forgiveness period is going to be. So rather than the 8 weeks as it originally was in the CARES Act, and then 24 weeks as it was in the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, hasn't this been so fun, you guys, going through all these iterations? You now get to pick any date to kind of close out your forgiveness period between that 8-week and 24-week mark. So this is going to resolve a lot of concerns for folks who were blowing through their PPP dollars well in advance of that 24-week forgiveness period mark. But as most of you probably know, all of the penalties on forgiveness are also pegged to your forgiveness period. So your full-time employee reductions, your salary reductions. So this will allow you to not only sort of design your forgiveness period for how quickly you spend your dollars, but also to tailor that to any sort of staff or salary changes you may have had to make after the, February 15th seems to be the magical sort of trigger date. So Blair, I think we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then, so generally what the legislation does is it extends the original program to March 31st. Same with the second draw program. So both of them are going to go through March 31st. What they've done is they have opened up the original program to a lot of new folks who were not eligible before. That includes the 501c6 organizations with very tough lobbying restrictions. They kept those, but also newspapers, broadcasting businesses, new farm businesses, so on and so forth. So there's going to be a whole new sort of pool of eligible entities under the original loans. And then, you know, a lot of the talk around the legislation is surrounding this second draw program. So if you received a loan under the original PPP program, you have 300 or fewer employees, and you can show for 1 quarter a 25% reduction at least in gross receipts between that quarter and the corresponding quarter back in 2019, then you'll be eligible, generally speaking, for this second draw program. So they're going to apply the same affiliation rules that they did for the first round. They're going to apply the same loan terms, the same forgiveness rules with a few little tweaks. So it's going to borrow pretty heavily and look a lot like the original program, but they're really focusing now on those smaller businesses that have a demonstrated sort of economic hit as a result of COVID. So I think those are the highlights of the new program. I will say that they're going to keep the 60% cap on payroll, or 60% requirement rather for payroll costs under the new loan program. So that's going to stay in place. You still have to make the need certification, so the same one that you did under the original program that's got a lot of people scrambling a little bit with that questionnaire these days. That's going to stick around. And the only other thing I'll mention, we've received this question from a couple of folks already. For those of you who have your PPP loans already, or your clients have their PPP loans, that magic date for rehiring, so for re-upping or truing up your full-time employee count, or getting salaries back up to pre-crisis levels, December 31st, 2020 remains the key date for you. So as I read the legislation, you're stuck with that December 31. So if you're in a jurisdiction like California right now, where things have been shut back down and they're really pulling back on business activity, you still have to keep in mind that if you want to get your full forgiveness and you've done salary or employee reductions, you got to keep those numbers up as of December 31st. For anybody who takes out a new loan on a go-forward basis after this legislation is enacted, your rehire relief goes until the end of your forgiveness period. So it's not going to be like this first round where you have kind of this long tail period at the end to try to make up those employee numbers and salaries. Instead, you're going to have to figure out how to keep those things high throughout your forgiveness period. So that's just something to flag for all of you guys. Some folks were hoping that they might give a little bit more leeway there. They did not. I think, Scott, anything else that we want to mention to these guys about the program changes?
So can I ask, I want to ask a couple questions that we may not be ready to answer yet, but for the second draw programs, are there any changes to the affiliation rules? So if you're a restaurant company and each of your facilities has fewer than 300 employees, does this change anything, or how will that work? Do we know yet?
We do know. So the affiliation rules, let's put it this way, the affiliation rule waivers that apply to the first program are going to continue to apply to the second program. But as Scott mentioned, instead of looking at that 500 employee count per location, you're going to be looking at 300 employees per location. And that's the same for that provision on businesses that have more than one location. You guys might remember that got added in that Flexibility Act. Same thing there. The same mechanics are going to apply. You're just going to bump down that 500 number to the 300 number.
And a related question, the $2 million loan cap under the second draw program, does that apply if you're a restaurant company by facility or to all the commonly owned entities?
So if it works the same way, well, it should work the same way that the original program worked. The one thing though that is different for restaurants, so and hotels, so the 72 NICS code businesses, so generally lodging, accommodations, and food, they actually have a different maximum loan amount calculation under this new program. So for most entities, you're going to do 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs over some look back period. And you get to decide whether that look back period is the prior year from a loan origination or calendar year 2019. Multiply that by 2.5, that's your second draw maximum loan amount up to the 2 million cap. But for restaurants, for those 72 code businesses, you actually get to do your average monthly payroll cost times something higher, 3.5. 3.5 up to that 2 million mark. So in theory, these guys are going to be eligible, again, I think per location for that higher dollar amount. I may have just confused people more than help there.
I think that, hey, Joel, we have other questions?
I have not seen any on the PPP side, so it does give me an opportunity to, first of all, comment on Kate's very good Christmas attire, very much in the season and appreciated. Let me also ask back, there were major provisions on FSAs and carry forwards that employers need to know about. Any comments on those, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, basically they've just taken the normal year-end deadline for use of your FSA funds and extended it a year. So you can carry over monies that were put in 2020 through 2021.
And there were provisions that seemed to build on the Supreme Court decision on the blues from an antitrust standpoint. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners was very upset at these provisions. I'm not so sure that we would be upset with them. Comments on what they did there?
Yeah, this is a bill that's been around for a long time. It's passed the House several times before. It had never been taken up in the Senate. I do wonder, I do not know, but I wonder whether the Big Blue settlement kind of got some of the senators off the dime on this. But it essentially removes the antitrust exemption for health insurance companies, but it retains their ability to do rating type activities in accordance with state law. I don't personally think it's going to be that impactful, but I could be wrong.
I did miss this one. Kate, Jim Parker asked, any new money for this PPP run or repurposing former funds?
Yeah, for sure. So I should have led with that. They put about 285 billion more into the SBA's fund for the sort of a re-up of the original program and for the second round of loans. I will say though that they have carved out not insignificant sums within that 285 billion for employees that are very small, so 10 or fewer employees, for businesses that are located in low or middle income communities. And then also, depending on your lender. So they've carved out loans that can be made by credit unions, small lending institutions, so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of slotting in that they're going to have to do for some of those funds, but they did put a decent bucket of funding back in.
And back to surprise billing, Scott, Tom Larson asked, for the regulations to be issued regarding the process for resolving out-of-network and the IDR, do you believe those would need to be included as health plan document provisions? This is where I'm glad to have smart lawyers working for me.
No, I don't think that the disclosures are going to need to include the IDR resolution process for payment between payer and provider. They're going to have to include basically the rights that the enrollee has in those out-of-network scenarios.
With that, Mr. Copperwood, any ground that you would like for Kate and Scott to cover, or any comments that you would like to make? And I invite her to
I
discuss.
just want to get everyone I want to get out of the way. Wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Joel, I think you covered all the political landscape at the front end. I would only note that there's a lot of hope, I think, from this package, that this package originated from the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, and they are hopeful that with the new margins in the next caucus, that this could be a new day and a new path forward to finding more bipartisanship on big packages like this. And we've heard from the Biden administration that this is hopefully only the first bite at the apple for more stimulus measures. So I hope that they are right and we see more bipartisanship moving forward. But with that said, I hope everyone has a great, safe holiday and a Merry Christmas.
Hey,
Wow.
Joe,
Listen to you being go ahead, Scott.
PPP question about the audits for more than $2 million loan recipients and any tips on the current questionnaires that are required. We do have a couple tips. One is you got to fill them out.
Yeah.
The second is, look, they're requesting a lot of information about what happened in the wake of your receipt of the loan, how your economic performance was in the second, third, and fourth quarters vis-a-vis your economic performance in 19. But that's not the data you were looking at when you were making your decisions on whether or not to apply for these loans in March and April. And so I think it's important that you clarify two things in making those answers. One is to really try to lay out what you were looking at when you applied for the loan and the reason you thought you had an economic necessity for requesting the funds. And the second is, if you decided not to do any sort of furloughing or RIFs in reliance upon receipt of that money, you should note that because that was really the purpose of the money, was to allow employers to keep people on their payrolls. And if you use the money in that way and you did that, it's important, I think, to note it. Kate, do you have anything else you'd suggest on those?
Yeah, so I would add a couple of things based on the new legislation, and I appreciate this question because I think it's an important one. One, they have now explicitly excluded any publicly traded entities from qualifying for these loans. So those guys, they got a lot of scrutiny at the beginning. Now they're completely out. The other thing I'll mention is that the new legislation has a lot more sort of accountability of the SBA to Congress. So they need to do more regular reports. They need to testify in front of Congress on a regular basis regarding their audit plan for these loans. So a lot of folks, before this bill came out, were agitating to get rid of the questionnaire. This is this retroactive sort of mission that they're on to try to get people in trouble, and so there were a lot of folks advocating for that. I think now that they're kind of on the hook for this oversight by Congress even more than they were before, they're going to stick to their guns on these audits. It's a structure that they have in place that they can sort of justify, and it does give them that sort of check the box for the larger loan amounts, saying, yeah, we're looking at all these to make sure that nothing fishy was going on. So the overall tone in the legislation, I think, is we're not going to see any relaxing or loosening of this audit activity. If anything, they're going to become more prickly, because now they've got to turn around and report to the Democratic House about what it is they're doing to manage this program.
Couple of other, this is probably my fault for not tracking this so closely, but does the FSA extension also apply to dependent care spending accounts or just medical FSAs?
I believe it's just medical, but we should check on it.
Yeah, we should, because in previous legislation, there was definitely more flexibility for those dependent care FSAs. We had not been as focused on that, so I would not be surprised to see some relief for them in this legislation.
Jennifer just told us it is for both, and thank you for noting that very quickly to us, Jennifer. Casey asked, did I understand correctly that this law closes the Main Street lending program?
Well, I think that the Main Street lending program is effectively closed because they've taken the money back. That was the big fight over the repurposing of the CARES Act funds. So those windows are now closed. I think the only remaining program that's still funded is the TALF.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from Chris. Aren't surprise billing claims also subject to external review now? If so, that would probably need to be done in the SPD, to go back to the question about what goes in the plan.
So the question we got was, do you need the details of the dispute resolution process included in your plan summary? And the answer to that is no. What I think you will need in your plan summary and other plan documents are what the enrollee's rights are in those scenarios where they're receiving out-of-network services in an emergency room setting or from an in-network provider or facility or air ambulance services. That will have to be disclosed, right? That they're not going to be responsible for out-of-network charges. They'll pay at a network rate, et cetera. So yes, there are going to be changes to those documents, but they'll be limited to basically the enrollee rights. Kate, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to add, Scott, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of external review, there is some audit process in there for reviewing those median contract rates, right, to make sure that there's no weird gaming going on there. Now that, you know, that kind of plays a fundamental role in this structure.
Yeah, there's an audit process for the median contracted rights that'll include random sampling. For the other obligations, I don't recall any kind of specific audit provision, but there are complaint provisions. So you're still subject to enforcement if your documents don't satisfy the requirements or if you're not living by the new requirements as of January 1st, 2022.
Interesting big picture question from David. Does the balanced billing legislation effectively kill the future for the reference-based pricing model? Has implications for it, right?
I sure think it doesn't help. I think you saw that whole idea of something Medicare reference price became toxic. I mean, you saw Republican politicians speaking directly to that and sort of beating back that threat. And I think it's probably part of their whole, you know, the whole retort against Medicare expansion. It's probably getting caught up in there. So yeah, I think that's how I would read it. Kate, you disagree with that?
No, I think that's it. And what we had heard from Scott and I were just talking about this the other day is when we had our conversation with CB a long time ago when these surprise billing proposals were coming out and the focus was really on the benchmark rate at that time. There was some thought that the providers would not like the benchmark rate for multiple reasons, but one of which is that over the long term, then it has sort of the effect of compressing all of the rates in the market to that benchmark or to that median rate. So, you know, anybody who before was charging higher than that rate feels like they've got a lot to lose. While you do have some people probably below the rate who feel like they're probably going to gain something here. But in theory, you know, to your point earlier, your question earlier, Joel, about publishing these decisions by these arbitrators, as we get more and more of a feel for what should be charged for these different, you know, services and items, that's gonna, I think that puts a lot of pressure in the long term on kind of coalescing around a more uniform, standardized pricing structure.
And so as we're winding down, Scott and Kate, just back up, big picture. A couple of folks joined us late. What are your top 2 or 3 takeaways for commercial insurance brokerage and implications for this legislation?
Scott?
Well, obviously, you know, it's going to be a little bit different world on broker comp disclosure. I think it's an opportunity in terms of plan structure because of the disclosures that will be required of other service providers. I think the big question there is going to be when you have a wholly owned PBM that's part of the insurance plan, like an Aetna or something, how is that disclosed, or is it really part of the premium? And that'll be one of the battles for the rulemaking. On the surprise billing side, you know, it closes the door on what's been a big blight on the industry in terms of the billions of dollars that plan participants are subject to that have been beyond their control, and it's been a nightmare for many of them. So in that respect, I think it improves the overall system from the plan participants' perspectives. I think from the employer side, you know, it's going to be a watch and see on how onerous the arbitration process really is. and whether it's sort of a transitionary phase so you can build, as somebody noted, kind of a common law of what some of these out-of-network charges should look like, or whether it's going to be a grudge match till the end. There's going to be gaming, right? You're going to have the hedge fund or the private equity funds that own some of the emergency service providers. They're going to put them together into one company, at least within a geographic region, so they can argue that they're all one provider. I think, we're going to have to look at that on the self-insurance side, and whether they can somehow aggregate themselves under the same preferred provider network within whatever the rules are, so they can take advantage of the same kind of negotiation and batching claims resolution. So I think that's kind of, to me, those are the big issues that emerge. Kate, what do you see?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that out of this legislation. And I think, even more broadly speaking, there's going to be a huge, huge role for brokers and consultants next year because, just the rulemakings coming out of this legislation, but then all the things that we expect, the Biden administration to roll back, particularly in the healthcare space, from what the Trump administration did. There's going to be a lot of change. People are going to need a lot of guidance on new rules, requirements, the transparency requirements that came out a couple months ago that we've been very focused on. I think there's going to be a lot of new implementation type questions and helping these employers think through options that are newly available, may not be available anymore. A lot of change, a lot of, stuff up in the air. So,
Kate, are you suggesting that 28 days from now, Donald Trump is not going to still be the president?
We don't make political comments like that. That's your purview.
Well, let me conclude with this. At the outset of this, I noted it was Christmas Eve, and Kimberly Tilley noted that it's Festivus. And I'd heard the term before. I was never a Seinfeld guy, so I had to pull it up. Festivus is a secular holiday celebrated on December 23rd as an alternative to the pressures and commercialism of the Christmas season. And the origin was that in a 1997 episode of Seinfeld called The Strike, which aired during the show's 9th season, George Costanza's father, that was Jerry Stiller, I didn't know that part, decided he was staging a one-man war on Christmas. In lieu of celebrating a crassly commercialized holiday, Frank was going to start his own tradition, Festivus. So from all of us at the council, unless anything else to add, Blair, Joel, Scott, Kate, we all wish good, happy holidays and safe holidays for you, for your family. And we thank you all for all that you've done for us this year. And we'll see you soon, probably after the new year. All the best to you.
Bye, everybody.